She traveled thousands of miles to meet a man, only to learn he was dead. No one came to pick her up. No one apologized. Only strange eyes stared at her as if she were something pitiful. But Evelyn Cross didn't come here for pity. She came to start over. And if fate wanted to slam doors shut in front of her, she would break down that wall herself. Like and comment the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. Stay tuned to the end because this is the story of a woman no one trusted, yet who changed an entire land. The stagecoach hit a rut somewhere outside of town, and the jolt sent Evelyn Cross's hat tumbling off her head and onto the floor between a sleeping farmer's muddy boots. She picked it up without a word, set it back on, and pressed her forehead against the window glass to watch the land opening up around her. Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory. Population, the advertisement had said, of 400 and growing. She'd been staring at that advertisement for 7 months. It was folded so many times the creases had gone soft and white, the ink bleeding at the corners where her fingers had worn through. She'd memorized every word. Respectable rancher, 38 years of age, seeks educated woman of sound character for companionship and partnership in frontier life. Letters may be directed to Mr. Harold Gentry, Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory. She had written him 4 letters before he wrote back. Careful letters, not romantic ones. She wasn't that kind of woman, and she hadn't pretended otherwise. She'd told him she was 31, that she'd worked as a school teacher in Ohio for 6 years, that she had no family left to speak of, and that she was not looking to be saved. She was looking for a fair exchange. He had written back and called her refreshing. That word had carried her a long way. The town materialized out of the brown scrubland like something half-finished and mostly forgotten. A main street of wooden storefronts, a water trough running green with algae, a church with a crooked steeple, and a scattering of houses pushed back from the road as though they'd retreated from each other in disagreement. It was smaller than she'd imagined, harder looking. The coach rocked to a stop outside the depot, and the driver called down their arrival. Evelyn waited while the farmer with the muddy boots gathered himself and climbed out first. Then she straightened her jacket, checked that her hat was level, picked up her traveling bag, and stepped down into the afternoon sun. She looked up and down the street. Nobody was waiting. She told herself that meant nothing. He was probably running late. Ranchers kept irregular hours. That was something she knew. She set her bag down beside her feet and stood with her hands folded and watched the other passengers drift away toward waiting families and familiar faces. And she kept her expression neutral while she did it. 20 minutes passed. A dog wandered over and sniffed her boot, then wandered off again. She picked up her bag and walked to the depot window. "Excuse me," she said to the man behind the glass who was writing something in a ledger and didn't look up immediately. "I'm looking for a Harold Gentry. He was supposed to meet me here." The man looked up then. Something moved across his face, recognition, or something close to it, and he put his pen down. "Harold Gentry," he repeated. "Yes." He took a slow breath and folded his hands on the counter. "Ma'am, I'm real sorry to tell you this. Harold Gentry passed on, about 3 weeks back now. Heart, they said." The words landed in a strange sequence, like she heard them one at a time with a pause between each one. She stood very still. "He's dead," she said. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. Were you expecting him?" "I was his intended." She heard how flat her voice came out. She wasn't trying to make it flat. It simply was. "We had an arrangement. I've come from Cleveland." The man behind the glass looked genuinely pained. "Lord, he never mentioned. I don't think anyone knew he was expecting." "He knew," Evelyn said. She thanked the man, which was perhaps an odd thing to do, but she'd been raised to thank people even when they delivered bad news, and some reflexes ran too deep to break. She picked up her bag and walked out of the depot and stood again on the street in the afternoon sun and thought, with a very clear and deliberate kind of calm, about what she had left. $12.40. The clothes she was wearing and what fit in her bag. A letter of reference from the school principal in Cleveland that she'd been careful to have written on good paper. A return ticket to Ohio that she'd kept folded in her boot just in case, which she now reached down and checked was still there. She could use it. She could be on the next coach east and be back in Cleveland inside of a week, and she could go to her former employer's door and ask for her position back and live the same life she'd been living before Harold Gentry's advertisement had made her think something else was possible. The thought sat in her stomach like cold water. She was still standing there, doing the arithmetic of her situation, when she heard a child crying. Not the ordinary crying of tiredness or frustration. This was the sharp, startled kind, the kind that meant something had gone wrong physically and hurt. Evelyn turned toward the sound. Across the street and down a ways, a little girl of maybe 4 or 5 had fallen near the hitching post outside the general store. She was sitting in the dust with one hand pressed to her knee and her face screwed up in the effort of not crying harder than she already was. Standing over her was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, who was crouching down and saying something. And even from across the street, Evelyn could see the inadequacy of whatever he was saying because the child kept crying, and he kept looking around as though the answer to this problem might be standing somewhere nearby. Evelyn crossed the street. She didn't make a decision about it exactly. She just crossed the street, set her bag against the hitching post, and crouched down beside the little girl. "Let me look," she said, gently but plainly. And the girl, surprised enough by the appearance of a stranger to pause in her crying, lifted her hand away from her knee. The scrape was ugly, a long one, running from just below the knee down to the top of the shin, embedded with grit from the street. It was bleeding in thin lines, and it had to hurt considerably, but it was not serious. "That is a very respectable scrape," Evelyn said. "You must have been moving at some speed." The girl looked at her with wet eyes and a wobbling bottom lip. "I fell," she said, like this needed stating. "I can see that. What's your name?" "Lily." "Lily, I'm Evelyn. Can I clean this up for you? It'll sting, but only for a moment, and it'll feel better after." The girl considered this with the gravity that only small children and very old people bring to decisions. Then she nodded. Evelyn opened her bag. She kept a small medical kit. Not much, just clean cloth, a tin of salve, some bandaging. Because she'd learned years ago that the world produced injuries at a consistent rate, and it helped to be prepared. She shook out her water canteen over the wound to rinse it, blotted it dry with clean cloth, applied a thin layer of salve, and bandaged it with the competence of someone who'd cleaned up hundreds of scraped knees over years of teaching children. "There," she said. She sat back on her heels. "Better?" Lily examined her knee with solemn attention. "It doesn't sting anymore." "Good." The man had been silent through all of this. Now Evelyn stood and looked at him properly for the first time. He was weathered in the way men got from years of outdoor work. The kind of tan that went into the skin rather than sitting on top of it, lines at the corners of his eyes, jaw rough, with a day or two of beard he hadn't gotten around to attending to. He was probably somewhere in his late 30s. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name, somewhere between wariness and something more reluctant. "Thank you," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected and careful with it, like a man who didn't use it more than necessary. "She's fine," Evelyn said. She picked up her bag from the hitching post. You crossed the street." She was hurt. He seemed to find this answer insufficient, but he didn't push at it. "You're not from here." "No. I arrived just now." She paused, because there was nothing else to say about that without explaining the whole situation, and she didn't feel like explaining it. "I'm going to inquire about a room." She started to turn away. "There's only one boarding house," he said. "Mrs. Pratt's, 2 blocks north." She nodded. "Thank you." She had walked maybe 10 steps when he spoke again. "Ma'am?" Something in the tone of it made her stop. "My name's Cole Dawson. I run a cattle ranch out about 6 miles east of here. He stopped, seemed to reorganize whatever he was about to say. "I heard what the depot man told you through the window there. About Gentry." Evelyn turned around slowly. "I'm sorry," Cole Dawson said. "That's a hard thing to come all that way for." She studied him. He wasn't saying it the way some men said sorry to a woman in trouble, with that particular quality of interest that had nothing to do with sympathy. He was just saying it because it was true, and he'd apparently decided she should hear it from someone who meant it. "Thank you," she said. "That's kind." He nodded. Lily had gotten back to her feet and was holding onto his hand and looking at Evelyn with undisguised curiosity. "You're pretty," Lily announced. "Lily," Cole said, a parental correction in his voice. "It's a compliment," the little girl said, reasonably. Evelyn almost smiled. "Thank you, Lily." She went to find Mrs. Pratt's boarding house. "Ducked." The room was $4 a week, which was 2 weeks of options if she spent nothing else. Mrs. Pratt was a heavy-set woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and the directness of someone who'd run a boarding house long enough to lose patience with anything that wasted time. "You here for the Gentry thing?" she asked after Evelyn gave her name. She was leading her upstairs, the stairs creaking under both their weights. "He was my intended, yes. Shame. He was a decent enough man, far as I heard. Not much for company, but decent." She unlocked a door at the end of the hall. "Here. Breakfast is 6, supper 7, no exceptions. I don't extend credit." "I understand." "What are you going to do?" The question was blunt enough to be almost rude, but Evelyn had the sense Mrs. Pratt asked it because she was genuinely wondering and genuinely willing to listen to the answer, not because she was looking to gossip. "I'm not certain yet," Evelyn said honestly. "I'll figure something out." Mrs. Pratt gave her a look that was not unsympathetic. "There's laundry work available at the hotel if you need it fast. It's hard work, but it's steady pay." "I'll keep that in mind. Thank you." The room had a narrow bed and one window that looked out at the back alley and a dresser with a cracked mirror. Evelyn set her bag down and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself, for exactly the length of time it took to breathe in and breathe out 5 times, feel the full weight of where she was. The exhaustion of the journey. The particular humiliation of arriving to nothing, the way the calculation of her situation, $12, dwindling, sat like a stone behind her breastbone. Then she got up and unpacked her bag. She had come from a family that had nothing, and then had less. Her father had died owing money. Her mother had followed 3 years later, worn down by the effort of making something out of their diminished circumstances. Evelyn had spent her 20s making herself useful, making herself indispensable, because she'd learned early that sentiment didn't translate into rent paid or food on the table, but skill did. She could teach. She could keep accounts. She could organize a household, manage a schedule, deal with difficult people without losing her composure. These were not small things. She had built her whole life on not being small about them. Harold Gentry had offered a chance at something different. Not love. She had not been under any illusions about that. But partnership, a place, a direction. She was not going back to Cleveland. She'd decided that before she'd finished unpacking her first dress from the bag. She did not know exactly what she was going to do, but she was not getting on a coach east. She slept badly that night, which was not surprising. Well, the next morning she went to the general store before breakfast because she had things to learn about this town, and the general store was where information moved. The owner was a man named Gus Fielder, somewhere in his 50s, who seemed pleasantly inclined toward conversation. She bought a small amount of thread she didn't need and asked questions while she looked at nothing in particular. She learned that Red Hollow had been dealing with a run of difficult seasons. Water rights on the eastern grazing land were being contested by a man named Victor Granger, who owned a large tract of land north of town and had recently acquired, through means nobody could quite explain, the controlling interest in the bank. Several small ranchers had sold their properties to Granger in the past 2 years, some of them after receiving what people described vaguely as pressure, though nobody seemed willing to be specific about what that meant. The sheriff, a man named Dale Pruitt, was understood to be Granger's man, though again people were quiet about the details. "Granger's buying up everything east of the main road," Gus said, not volunteering any particular opinion about this, just stating it the way you stated weather. "Cole Dawson's place is about the last holdout on that stretch. Gentry had a parcel there too, which is probably why—" He stopped himself, seemed to decide not to finish that particular sentence. "Cole Dawson," Evelyn repeated. "The man from yesterday. The one with the little girl. Good man. Stubborn as a stump, which is probably what's kept him out there this long. Lost his wife 2 years ago. That Lily of his is the sweetest kid in the territory, but raising her alone while keeping a cattle operation running—" Gus shook his head with the expression of a man who respected effort, even when it looked like it was losing. Evelyn paid for her thread. She walked out into the morning. She stood on the boardwalk for a while, watching the town wake up around her. A wagon loaded with lumber rolling through. 2 women in aprons talking outside the milliner's. A boy chasing a dog around the corner of the feed store. She thought about what she was good at. She thought about what was needed. She thought about the direction of 6 miles east of town, and a cattle ranch, and a little girl with a bandaged knee. Then she walked to the livery stable and asked if she could hire a horse for the morning. She'd learned to ride in Ohio at the insistence of an aunt who believed a woman who couldn't handle a horse was at the mercy of anyone with a wagon. The horse the liveryman gave her was old and placid and had an opinion about its pace that mostly aligned with Evelyn's, which was that there was no reason to hurry. The eastern road was rutted and ran through scrubland that softened, eventually, into low grassland. Better grazing ground. She could see that, the kind of land that had value if you worked it right. She found the Dawson property by the sign at the gate, which needed repainting. The fence line beyond it was in reasonable repair. She rode up to the house and stopped. It was a solid structure, 2 stories, well-built, the kind of house that had been put up with real intention and some care. But it had the look of a place that was being managed rather than lived in. The kitchen garden to the side was mostly weeds. The curtains in the front windows were mismatched. The porch had a broken board on the second step that had been left broken. She could see the barn further back, and beyond it, the cattle pasture. A ranch hand was working the fence line in the distance. Cole Dawson came out of the house before she'd gotten off the horse. He was wearing his work clothes, canvas pants, boots with hard use on them, a shirt that was clean but had seen better days. He looked at her with the same careful wariness as the day before, and then he looked at the horse, and then he looked back at her. "Miss Cross," he said. He had remembered her name. "Mr. Dawson." She dismounted without asking for help and tied the horse to the post. "I'd like to talk with you about a possible arrangement, if you have a few minutes." Something shifted in his expression, a brief, complicated thing that she might have called alarm, if alarm and wariness could share a face. "What kind of arrangement?" he said. Not a question, more like a door being held at arm's length. "An employment arrangement." She kept her voice level. "I'm in a difficult position with limited options. You are, from what I can tell, a man who needs reliable help around this property. I'm a capable woman. I'm not asking you to do me a favor. I'm asking you to consider whether what I can offer has practical value to you." He said nothing, just looked at her. "I can teach your daughter," she said. "I can manage a household properly. I can keep accounts if you need it, and I learned enough about cattle operations from my grandfather's farm in Ohio to be useful without being helpless. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for honest work and fair pay." A long silence. From somewhere inside the house, she could hear Lily singing to herself. Some tuneless, meandering song that small children invented and sang for their own entertainment. "I don't need another ranch hand," Cole said. "I know. I'm not in the habit of bringing strangers into my home." "I understand that." He looked at her for a long moment. He seemed to be running some internal calculation, and she let him run it without interrupting. "You'd need a place to stay," he said slowly. "There's a room available at Mrs. Pratt's if the arrangement doesn't work. I'm not asking to live here as a condition of the conversation. I'm asking for a trial period, 1 week. At the end of it, you tell me honestly whether the work is useful or not, and we make a decision from there. And if I say no, then I'll go back to town and look for laundry work at the hotel, and we'll never have to discuss it again." He looked at the house behind him, then back at her. She had the sense he was listening to the sound of Lily's singing. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put coffee on." The inside of the house confirmed what the outside had suggested. It was fundamentally a good home. Large kitchen, stone fireplace, solid furniture, but it was the home of a man running on reserves. The dishes were clean but stacked wrong. The curtains needed washing. There were boots and pieces of tack in places that had nothing to do with boots and tack. It was the house of someone managing, not maintaining. Lily appeared from the back hallway with her knee still bandaged and a fistful of wildflowers she'd obviously been arranging and rearranging for some time. Her face lit up when she saw Evelyn. Not with the excitement of a child seeing something new, but with a more specific recognition, the kind that said she remembered exactly who Evelyn was. "You came," Lily said. "I did," Evelyn said. "How's your knee?" "Better? I didn't pick at the bandage." "Good girl." Cole had gone to the stove. He put water on with the efficient motions of a man who'd made his own coffee for a long time and had taken all the unnecessary steps out of it. He didn't look comfortable. He didn't look comfortable in his own kitchen, which Evelyn thought was perhaps the saddest thing she'd seen since she'd arrived in Red Hollow. She sat at the table across from Lily and listened to the little girl explain the provenance of each flower, which was apparently extensive. Cole brought coffee without asking how she took it, which was black, which turned out to be fine. They talked for an hour. Or rather, she answered his questions and he asked them in the careful, skeptical way of a man who had decided on a position and was looking for a reason to maintain it, but was not entirely certain the position was right. He wanted to know about her background. She told him. He wanted to know why she hadn't taken the coach back east. She told him that too, plainly, without dressing it up. "You don't strike me as someone who makes reckless decisions," he said at one point. "I don't," she agreed. "This isn't reckless. This is the only option I think is worth taking." He looked at her with those careful eyes. "And if it doesn't work, then I'll figure out the next thing." She held his gaze. "I've been figuring out the next thing for most of my adult life, Mr. Dawson. I'm reasonably experienced at it." Something shifted in his face then, not quite softening, more like a slight decrease in resistance. He looked at his coffee, looked at Lily, who had arranged her flowers into a circle on the table and was explaining their properties to an invisible audience. "1 week," he said. "You stay in the house. There's a room on the ground floor, was the housekeeper's room before." He said was without elaborating. "I'll pay you fairly for whatever work is actually done. At the end of the week, we talk honestly." "That's all I'm asking," Evelyn said. "And I'm not—" "This isn't—" He seemed to be having trouble finishing the sentence. "I'm not looking for a wife," he finally said, in the blunt tone of a man who had decided to say the difficult thing rather than let it sit. "I understand that," Evelyn said. "That wasn't what I came here for either." He nodded. She thought she saw a very slight easing of some tension she hadn't even fully noticed until it moved. "All right," he said. She went back to Mrs. Pratt's, paid for the 2 nights she'd used, packed her bag again, and rode back out to the Dawson Ranch before noon. The room she was given was small but clean, a narrow bed, a window that faced the kitchen garden, a hook on the door for her coat. She unpacked her things methodically and then went directly to the kitchen because there was work to do and she had told him she would do it, and she intended to. The kitchen garden took most of the afternoon. She cleared 3 seasons of neglect from it, pulling weeds until her hands ached, turning soil, assessing what was salvageable and what wasn't. More was salvageable than she'd expected. Some herbs had gone wild rather than dying, and there were onions that had seeded themselves and were coming back in a small patch near the fence. She planted the seeds she'd bought that morning in town. She'd stopped at the general store before the livery, thinking ahead, and watered everything in from the rain barrel beside the fence. Cole watched her from a distance for a while in the late afternoon. She noticed without looking directly at him. He didn't say anything. Eventually, he went back to the barn. At supper, she made a simple meal, pan bread and beans with the smoked sausage she'd found in the larder, which was better than it had any right to be given its circumstances. And Cole ate it without comment, but cleaned the plate, which she took as adequate review. Lily talked enough for all of them. She had opinions about many things, ranging from the character of various animals she'd observed to the question of whether stars were larger or smaller than they appeared, and she shared these opinions freely and without much care for whether the adults were following. After supper, Cole put Lily to bed. Evelyn washed up and sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and the household account book she'd found on the shelf, which she'd asked his permission to look at, and which he'd granted with a shrug that suggested it was either fine or he didn't have the energy to object. The accounts were a mess. Not dishonestly. There was no evidence of anything improper, just the ledger of a man who kept rough track of things in his head and wrote them down inconsistently. She could see the shape of the operation. It was viable. It was not comfortable. The debt column was not ruinous, but it was also not small, and the last 2 seasons showed lower cattle prices than she knew were typical. Cole came back to the kitchen and stopped when he saw her with the ledger. "I'm not making changes," she said. "I'm reading." "And?" She looked up. He was leaning in the doorway, arms crossed, the lamplight making him look more tired than he probably was. "You're managing," she said carefully, "but there's not a lot of margin." "I know." "The water rights situation Gus Fielder mentioned in town. I know about that too," he said, and something hardened in his voice. Not anger at her, just the particular hardness of a man who'd been dealing with something for a long time and had not resolved it. "All right," she said, and closed the ledger. She stood up and pushed her chair in. "I didn't mean to overstep." "You didn't." He unfolded his arms. You can look at it if you want. It's not good news, the numbers. I know, she said. Good night, Mr. Dawson. Cole? He said. If you're living here, you might as well call me Cole. She considered this for a moment. Evelyn, she said. Then. She went to her room and lay down in the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. The cattle moving somewhere distant, a horse stamping in the barn, the wind working at the eaves, and thought that this was the most uncertain she'd been in years, and also, somehow, the most like herself. She didn't know what the week would bring. She didn't know what the month would bring. She knew only that she was in the right place and doing the right thing, and that she was not going back to Cleveland, and that the little girl with the bandaged knee had said, "You came with an expression that suggested nobody showed up when they said they would," and Evelyn intended to change that assessment. She was asleep before the lamp in the kitchen went out. Outside, the Wyoming stars burned cold and indifferent overhead, and somewhere east of town, on 1,000 acres he'd been quietly acquiring for 2 years, a man named Victor Granger was looking at a map of the territory and considering what the Dawson Ranch might be worth when it finally became available. He did not consider that it might not become available. Men like Victor Granger rarely considered that possibility until it was too late to adjust. The first 3 days, Cole watched her the way a man watches weather he doesn't trust. Not hostile, not welcoming, just observant. He'd come in from the barn or the pasture, and his eyes would move across whatever she'd done, register it, and then move away without comment. She didn't push for comment. She hadn't come here for approval. She'd come because it was the only option that made sense, and she worked from that premise and let the results speak without narration. On the first full day, she finished the kitchen garden and turned her attention to the inside of the house. Not dramatically. She wasn't trying to make a point of what had been neglected. Just methodically, the way she did things. She washed the curtains and hung them to dry on the line, then rehung them before supper so the house looked the same but smelled of clean water and air. She found the broken porch step and dug through the small barn she'd located behind the main structure until she found planking and nails and a hammer, and she replaced the board herself, not because it was her business, but because she'd already turned her ankle on it twice, and the third time she might do real damage. Cole noticed the step. She saw it in the slight pause before he climbed the porch that evening, the brief look down and then up, and then nothing. He said nothing about it at supper. That was fine. Lily had no such restraint. She followed Evelyn everywhere that first week with the focused attention of a small scientist studying a new phenomenon, asking questions without pause, and apparently without concern for whether the questions were answerable. Why did weeds grow faster than food? Could you eat a horse if you had to? Was Cleveland bigger than Red Hollow? What did snow smell like before it fell? Evelyn answered everything as plainly and honestly as she could. When she didn't know, she told Lily she didn't know, and they tried to figure it out together, which Lily seemed to find more satisfying than a made-up answer would have been. Papa doesn't always know things either, Lily told her on the second afternoon, with the air of someone sharing confidential information. They were sitting at the kitchen table while Evelyn tried to teach her the letters of the alphabet using a flat stick and flour dusted on the tabletop. But he says he doesn't know less than men who say they do. That's a very wise thing, Evelyn said. Who taught him that? Lily thought about it. Mama, maybe. The word mama was dropped without particular weight or ceremony. Lily was too young to have learned yet how to carry it with caution. She said it the way she said any word, and then she moved on to whatever was next, and Evelyn let her, continuing to draw letters in the flour without pausing. She did not ask about the mother. She knew the broad facts. Widowed 2 years, the town's general sympathy expressed mostly in the form of casseroles that had reportedly arrived for about 3 weeks and then stopped. The rest was not her business unless it was offered. She was here to work, not to excavate a man's grief for the purposes of understanding his household. But grief had a way of being present, whether you discussed it or not. And in Cole Dawson's house, it was as much a feature of the rooms as the furniture. It was in the second coffee cup that sat on the shelf above the stove, different from all the others. Blue-glazed, delicate, the kind of cup a man's wife buys because she likes it, and he keeps afterward because he can't explain why, that nobody used, but that never moved. It was in the way he fell silent at supper sometimes, mid-sentence. Not because he'd forgotten what he was saying, but because he'd arrived somewhere internal and had to wait until it passed. It was in the way he talked to Lily, patiently, but with that particular effort of a man who knew he was doing his best and also knew his best was not exactly enough. She was not going to fix any of that. She was under no illusion that she could, but she could make the house a place that wasn't constantly working against him. On the fourth day it rained, hard and from the northwest, the kind of driving rain that found every gap in the eaves and turned the yard to mud and kept cattle bunched at the fence line with their heads down. Cole was out in it by 6 in the morning and didn't come in until almost noon, and when he came in he was wet through and stiff and said nothing, just stood by the stove dripping while Evelyn handed him a towel and moved aside so he had room. She had soup on, not fancy, just whatever had been in the larder combined into something hot and solid. He changed his shirt and came back to the kitchen and ate 2 bowls without speaking, and she sat across the table keeping Lily occupied with drawing shapes and let the quiet be what it was. "The northwest fence has a run of posts that won't last another season," he said eventually. He said it to no one in particular, or possibly to himself. "How long a run?" He looked up, apparently having expected no response. "Maybe 40 yards. Can you get the post from the timber near the creek?" A pause. "You've been out to the creek?" "Lily showed me. There's good straight timber there, if you have the time to cut it." She picked up Lily's escaped crayon from the floor and handed it back. "I don't know if you do." "Not in the next week," he admitted, which was an admission, she realized, that the work was outpacing him. He didn't look comfortable saying it. "Is there someone who could help with the cutting? Not a hired hand, just a neighbor?" Cole looked at her with a complicated expression. "Most of the neighbors I had in common with that timber have sold off to Granger. The ones left are trying to keep their own operations together." She thought about what Gus Fielder had told her in the store. "And Granger's been after your property too." "He's been after everyone's. But yours specifically." He set down his spoon. The rain hammered at the windows. Lily had given up on shapes and was drawing something elaborate that appeared to be a horse with a hat. "My parcel sits on top of the best water access on the eastern range," Cole said. "The creek that feeds my land feeds 3 other parcels downstream, but those are already Granger's. If he gets my land, he controls where the water goes on that whole stretch. He can divert it, restrict it, charge for it. He could drain the eastern range in 2 seasons if he wanted to." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "What's he offered you?" 80 cents on the dollar of what the land's worth, which he gets to decide the value of, and a suggestion that the offer tends to get worse the longer you wait. "Has there been anything else? Anything more than suggestions?" He looked at her. There was something in the look that said she'd walked closer to something than he'd expected. "Nothing I can prove," he said, and then he stood up, signaling the conversation's end. She didn't push. She picked up the bowls and washed them. That night she sat with the account ledger again, not to reorganize it. She'd asked his permission, and he'd given it, with the same shrug as before, but to look at the pattern of expenses and income over the past 3 years. She was good with numbers. She'd always been good with numbers, which was part of why she'd been put in charge of the school's administrative books in Cleveland. Numbers told a story, if you knew how to read it. The Dawson Ranch's story was of a man who'd started from a decent position and had been slowly pressured smaller by a combination of bad seasons, falling cattle prices, and she noticed this in the 3rd column, where he'd recorded a series of payments she hadn't understood at first. Fines. Small ones, irregularly spaced, each with a 2 or 3 word explanation in his handwriting. Boundary dispute settlement, water access fee, pasture inspection penalty. None of them were enormous. All of them were wrong. She sat with that for a while. Then she closed the ledger and went to bed. On the 5th day, she asked him about the fines. She did it after Lily was asleep, when Cole was sitting on the porch with his boots off and a tin cup of something that was technically coffee, but had been on the stove long enough to transcend the category. She came out and leaned against the rail and looked at the dark yard. "The fine's in the ledger," she said. "They're not legitimate." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the dark. "The boundary dispute was settled by a surveyor before that fine was issued," she said. "I can see it in the order of entries. The survey was done in March. The fine came in June, but the dispute was closed." "Dale Pruitt's office issued the fine," Cole said. "The sheriff." "That's right." She let that sit for a moment. "And the water access fee?" There's no corresponding water rights record in the column where you note them. You paid it, but it wasn't for anything official. Someone just sent you a bill. Granger's land management office. His voice had gone flat. Not defensive, just flat. The way a voice went when it was describing something that had been enraging for long enough to no longer produce heat. Sent a letter claiming I owed fees for accessing creek water that runs through my own land. My lawyer in town, Henry Foley, told me it wasn't valid, but he also told me fighting it would cost more than paying it. How much did it cost you to fight things that weren't valid? A silence. Cole? Over 2 years? He looked at his coffee. More than I'm comfortable saying. That's the point, Evelyn said. It's not about the money specifically. It's about making you too tired and too short to fight the next thing. By the time the real pressure comes, you're already worn down. He looked at her then. The first time he'd looked at her directly in a conversation like this, without the slight sideways quality of a man maintaining some distance. I know that, he said. I figured that out about a year ago. Then why haven't you... She stopped herself. Why haven't I what? His voice had an edge, not angry, just present in a way it hadn't been before. I was going to say, why haven't you organized with the other ranchers, but I already know that answer. Most of them have sold. And the ones that haven't are scared of what organizing might cost them. He set down the cup. Granger has the sheriff. He has the bank. He's got friends in the territory office in Cheyenne. You go up against that without enough men and enough proof, you don't wound him. You just make yourself a target. So you wait. I stay on my land. I pay what I have to pay to avoid the things that would force me off. I keep the operation running, and I wait for him to overplay. And if he doesn't overplay before you run out of margin? He didn't answer that. She hadn't expected him to. Some questions didn't have good answers, and saying so didn't help anything. She went back inside. He stayed on the porch a while longer. She fell asleep listening to the old boards settle under his weight. On the morning of the 6th day, Lily got sick. Not seriously, a fever and a sore throat, the kind of thing children produced with apparent ease and adults greeted with exhausted resignation. But Lily's fever ran higher than it should by mid-morning, and Cole, who Evelyn had noticed was a competent man in most circumstances, became in this specific circumstance someone who stood in doorways looking at his daughter with an expression of barely controlled alarm and no clear idea what to do about it. She needs cool water and rest, Evelyn told him. She had her hand on Lily's forehead and was counting the girl's breaths. Even, not labored, her chest was clear. It's not her chest. She's not having trouble breathing. It's just a fever. I should get the doctor. Is there a doctor in Red Hollow? Cole stopped. There was one. He moved on last fall. Then going to town won't help immediately. I need a basin and cool water and clean cloths, and willow bark tea if you have it. Do you? He looked blank. I don't know what I have. I'll find it. Get me the basin and water. He was useful once he had specific instructions, which she filed away as information about him. He was not the kind of man who was good at uncertainty. He was good at work, at solving a defined problem, at effort directed toward a clear purpose. It was the formless threats, the ones you couldn't hit directly, that ate at him. She found willow bark in the back of the larder, tucked behind a tin of salt, which told her whoever had kept this kitchen before had known what they were doing. She made the tea and sweetened it with a small amount of honey and got most of it into Lily by promising to tell her a story about a woman who could speak to horses, which Evelyn invented as she went, and which Lily, despite her fever, listened to with complete absorption. Cole sat in the chair in the corner of Lily's room. He didn't offer to help. He didn't interfere. He sat in the chair with his forearms on his knees and watched Evelyn work. And there was something in the watching that went beyond this immediate moment, something deeper and longer and not entirely about Lily's fever at all. By afternoon, the fever had come down enough that Lily fell into a real sleep, the deep, boneless sleep of a child who has decided the emergency is over. Evelyn came out of the room and nearly ran into Cole in the hallway, who had been standing there, apparently, while she'd been settling Lily. She's sleeping, Evelyn said. Fever's down. She needs to rest today and probably tomorrow, but she'll be fine. He nodded. His jaw moved slightly, the working of a man who had something to say and was deciding on the architecture of it. Thank you, he said. It was a fever. I know what it was. Something in his voice was different, Not softer exactly, more like the controlled quality had dropped by one layer, and whatever was underneath was just barely in the conversation. She's all I've... He stopped, pressed his mouth together for a moment. I should be better at this by now. At what? At knowing what to do when she's sick. At any of the parts of it. He said it plainly, without self-pity, which somehow made it harder to hear. Her mother knew. I watched her and I tried to learn it, but I didn't learn enough, and then she was gone, and I've been guessing since. Evelyn stayed very still. Her mother died here? She asked quietly. In the house? The baby didn't... It was a difficult birth, and neither of them... He stopped again. Lily doesn't know about the baby. She was too young. She just knows about her mother. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. I keep the ranch running, he said, and now the words came a little faster, like he'd been holding them back long enough that once they started, they had momentum. I keep Lily fed and clothed, and I try to teach her what I know. I read to her at night because her mother said it mattered. I know I'm not enough. I know there's things she needs that I don't know how to give, and I've been trying to figure out how to live with that for 2 years, and mostly what I've figured out is that I can't. Evelyn watched him. He wasn't asking for sympathy, and she wasn't going to offer it as a replacement for an honest response. You're enough, she said. Not perfect. Enough. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at her. She's not afraid, Evelyn said. I've been watching her for almost a week. Children who are missing something fundamental are afraid in a particular way. Anxious, clingy, prone to collapse when small things go wrong. Lily is not any of those things. She's a secure child who has a father she trusts. What she's also missing is someone who knows how to make willow bark tea and replace broken porch steps. And you can either carry that absence as a failure, or you can try to address it practically. A long silence. You've been thinking about this, Cole said. I think about most things, she said. It's a habit. He looked at the door to Lily's room, then at the floor, then at her. Stay, he said, not with any particular weight on it. The way you stated a thing you'd decided was true. Not just the week. Longer than that. However long it takes to, He paused. I don't know exactly what it takes to fix all of this, but stay while I figure it out. Evelyn considered him. He was a hard man who had not been made hard by cruelty, but by repeated experience with loss and a determination to keep going regardless. He was not particularly warm. He was not easy. He would be a difficult employer and probably a difficult person to live alongside, not because he was unkind, but because he kept everything close and worked through problems by himself and had a way of going silent that could last an entire evening. I'll stay, she said, on the condition that when I see something in the accounts that concerns me, I'm allowed to say so. And when I have a suggestion about anything in the house or the operation, I'm allowed to make it without you treating it as an intrusion. He seemed to find this an unusual set of conditions. All right, and I want access to those fines documentation, all of it. I want to write to the territory office in Cheyenne myself and see if anything in that paper trail is illegal enough to bring a formal complaint. This surprised him more. You know how to do that. I spent 6 years managing school administration, including a funding dispute with the city government. It's not the same thing, but I know how paper works and how official processes work, and I know what looks wrong when I see it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that careful look, the one that was still not quite trust, but had moved measurably in that direction. All right, he said again. She went to start supper. He went back to check on Lily. She could hear him through the door, speaking quietly to his sleeping daughter, not saying anything in particular, just the low sound of a father making sure his child knew he was there. She stood at the stove for a moment before she lit it, looking at the blue-glazed cup on the shelf above it, and then she turned away and struck a match. The week she'd asked for had ended. What came next was something she didn't have a clean word for, but she was not the kind of woman who needed clean words for things before she committed to them. She was committed. The ranch had shown her what it needed, and she had decided she was capable of providing it, and that was enough to go on. She made supper. Cole came out of Lily's room and set the table without being asked, finding the bowls in the right place because she'd reorganized the kitchen on day 2 in a way that was more logical than what it had been, and he'd apparently paid attention without saying so. They ate together and talked about the fence posts and the northwest pasture and how many head he was planning to move to summer grazing, and what the water situation would look like by August. And it was the most ordinary conversation she'd had in months. And it was also, she thought, the most honest. After supper, he got up and refilled her coffee without asking. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. She sat at the table for a while after he went to check the barn for the night, and she wrote 2 letters, one to Henry Foley, the lawyer in Red Hollow, asking for copies of the fine documentation, and one to the Territorial Records Office in Cheyenne asking about the legal basis for water access fees applied to private land. She was not certain anything would come of either, but she had learned that when you saw something being done wrong to someone who didn't have time to fight it themselves, you either looked away or you picked up the pen. She had never been good at looking away. Outside, the last light went out of the western sky, and the Wyoming dark came down complete, and the stars appeared in their impossible numbers, and from the barn she could hear Cole's voice, low and even, talking to a horse the way a man talks when he doesn't know anyone can hear him. Quietly and honestly, about nothing in particular. She sealed both envelopes. She put them by the door to take into town in the morning. Whatever Victor Granger was planning next, she intended to be ready for it before it arrived. The letters came back faster than she'd expected. Henry Foley's response arrived 8 days after she'd sent her inquiry, delivered by the regular post rider on a Tuesday morning while Cole was out checking the summer pasture fencing, and Lily was sitting in the kitchen garden pulling carrots with the focused satisfaction of someone engaged in important labor. Foley wrote in the compact, careful hand of a man accustomed to saying things precisely because imprecision in his profession cost people money. He confirmed that he could provide copies of all the fine documentation. He also noted, almost as an aside, 2 lines from the bottom of the first page, that he had himself submitted a similar inquiry to the Territorial Records Office the prior year and received no response. He did not say this to discourage her. He said it, she suspected, because he was a precise man and precision required honesty. The response from Cheyenne did not arrive at all. She waited another week before accepting this as information rather than delay. In the meantime, she had made herself so integrated into the daily working of the Dawson Ranch that removing her would have required a deliberate effort no one had any intention of making. She had reorganized the larder and the account ledger and the household schedule so that the mornings ran without the low-level friction that had previously been eating 20 minutes of everyone's day. She had started teaching Lily her letters in earnest, not just flour on a table, but a proper slate board she'd ordered from the general store and a set of primers she'd found in the bottom of a trunk in the back bedroom, still wrapped in cloth, unopened. Cole had looked at the primers when she'd brought them out, but said nothing about them, and she had left that silence alone. What she could not organize away was the ranch's fundamental vulnerability, and she was aware of this the way you were aware of a sound you couldn't quite locate, constantly, at low volume, under everything else. She and Cole had settled into a rhythm that was not quite friendship, and not quite a professional arrangement, but something between the two that neither of them had named. He told her things about the operation now without being asked, what he was worried about with the cattle, where the fence line was weakening, what he knew about Granger's recent acquisitions. She told him what she'd found in the accounts, what the letters had and hadn't said, what she was planning to try next. They talked most evenings on the porch after Lily was in bed, not long conversations, but honest ones, and she had come to value that kind of honesty the way you valued water in dry country. Not romantically, but with a solid understanding of what its absence meant. She was on the porch one evening in the 3rd week when she saw the rider. He came up the east road at a pace that was not hurried but not casual either, and he turned in at the Dawson gate without slowing, which meant he knew where he was going. Cole saw him from the barn and came across the yard, and Evelyn stayed on the porch and watched. The rider was young, mid-20s, well-dressed in the particular way that said the clothes were meant to communicate something. He handed Cole an envelope, said something she couldn't hear from the porch, and then turned his horse and rode back out the gate the way he'd come. The whole visit lasted under 2 minutes. Cole stood in the yard looking at the envelope for a moment before he came to the porch. He handed it to her without comment. It was from the office of Victor Granger, Land Holdings and Property Management, Red Hollow and Cheyenne. The language was formal and measured in the way legal language was when it had been designed to sound reasonable while being entirely unreasonable. It informed Cole Dawson that a review of Eastern Territory water rights had identified a series of access violations on his property. It cited 3 specific instances: It noted that a formal hearing had been scheduled at the sheriff's office for the following Friday. It suggested, in language that carried the particular texture of a suggestion backed by a wall, that Cole's situation would be considerably simplified if he were willing to discuss a private property resolution before that date. She read it twice. "These access violations," she said, "are any of them real?" "No." Cole's voice was flat. He was leaning against the porch rail with his arms crossed and looking at the middle distance. "The water that runs through my land runs through my land. I have the original land grant paperwork. It was filed with the territory in 1871. The water access was part of the original survey." "Do you have those documents here?" "Locked box in the bedroom. I've kept them there since the first fine letter." She folded the Granger letter back along its original creases. "I want to see them. All of them. And I want to write to Foley tonight and have him at that hearing on Friday." "Foley's a good lawyer, but he's not—" Cole paused. "Granger put pressure on his lease last year. Foley's office is in a building Granger now owns. I don't know exactly how much Foley is willing to put at risk." She thought about this. "Is there another lawyer?" "Not in Red Hollow. Nearest one is in Sutton Falls, 40 miles west. Write to him tonight. There's not enough time before Friday. Write anyway. If this hearing goes badly, we'll need someone for what comes after." She stood up. "Show me the land grant paperwork." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd seen on his face a handful of times. The one that was still adjusting to the fact of her, the continued slight surprise that she was here and engaged and not waiting to be told what to do. "All right," he said, and went inside. The documents were in better shape than she'd feared. The original land grant was clear. The survey markers precisely recorded, the water access clause written in the unambiguous language of a territory hungry for settlement that had needed to make property rights attractive and therefore had made them explicit. She spread them on the kitchen table and went through each one and made notes on a separate sheet of paper, dates, clause references, the specific language about water rights, until she had a summary compact enough to hand to Foley on Friday morning before the hearing. Cole sat across from her while she worked. He didn't talk much. He'd brought the coffee over and refilled her cup twice, and at some point he'd gotten up and made cornbread without consulting her about it, which appeared on the table beside her elbow while she was reading, and which she ate without looking up. When she finally put down her pencil, it was past 10. "We have a case," she said. "Not a comfortable one, because Pruitt's running the hearing and Pruitt's going to rule however Granger tells him to. But we have documents, and documented hearings, even corrupt ones, generate a paper trail. If Granger overreaches in that room on Friday, it goes on record. And if Pruitt doesn't overreach, if he just makes a quiet ruling against me on grounds nobody can immediately disprove, then we appeal to Cheyenne. I know the Cheyenne office hasn't responded to my letter, but a formal appeal from a lawyer is different from an inquiry from a woman nobody's heard of." She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "The point of Friday is not necessarily to win Friday. The point is to not lose anything that can't be recovered, and to document everything." Cole looked at her across the table. "You've done this before." "Not exactly this, but I know how institutions use process to exhaust people. The school I worked for had a facilities dispute with the city that ran 4 years. The city kept generating new hearings. The school kept losing small things and appealing, and eventually the city made a mistake in a formal document that gave the school's lawyer something real to work with." She set down the cup. "Granger's been doing this long enough that he thinks he knows exactly how far he can push before someone pushes back with something that matters. We have to let him believe that's still true while we find the thing that matters." Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up again and was working at the shutters on the west side of the house. "You said we," he noted. "I did. This isn't your fight." She looked at him steadily. "I live here. Those fines come out of your margin, and your margin is what keeps this household running. It is functionally my fight." He didn't argue with this. He looked at the documents spread between them on the table, then at her, then at the documents again. "All right," he said, for what felt like the 100th time. But this time it came out differently, not with the wariness of a man deciding whether to allow something, but with the particular quality of a man who has decided simply that someone is on his side. Friday came with the particular mercilessness of dates you're dreading, arriving before you've resolved how you feel about them. They rode into Red Hollow together, leaving Lily with the ranch hand Tom Briggs, who was reliable with children in the way some men were reliable with horses, patient, quiet, and unbothered by repetitive conversation. Lily had been told they were going to town for business and had accepted this with the equanimity of a child who trusted that the adults had things managed. Henry Foley met them outside the sheriff's office at 9. He was a small man in his 50s with the kind of meticulous appearance that came from genuine carefulness rather than vanity. Nothing about him was extravagant, but nothing was poorly attended to either. He shook Cole's hand and then turned to Evelyn with a slightly adjusted expression, the one people wore when they were reclassifying what they'd expected. "You wrote the letter," he said. "I did. You found the Cheyenne water access records." "I noted the absence of them," she corrected. "I couldn't find a legal basis for the fees because the territorial records don't appear to contain one." "They don't," Foley said. He opened his briefcase, a good one, well used, and showed them a document she hadn't seen. "I finally got a response from Cheyenne last week. The water access fee structure Granger's been applying isn't recognized by the territory. It's based on a draft regulatory proposal from 1878 that was never formally adopted." He looked at Cole. "You've been paying fees that had no legal basis." Cole absorbed this without expression, though Evelyn could see the angle of his jaw tighten. "Can we use this today?" she asked. "I brought it specifically for today," Foley said. "Whether Pruitt pays it any attention is another matter." Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a large man who had the quality of someone who'd been physically imposing long enough to rely on it as a substitute for other qualities. He was behind his desk when they came in, and he had the desk positioned so that anyone sitting across from it looked slightly up at him. Evelyn had seen this trick before, in the principal's office of the school where she'd taught, deployed by a man who needed furniture to do the work his personality couldn't. There were 2 other men in the room. One was a young clerk who appeared to be recording proceedings. The other was someone she didn't know, dressed well, past 60, with the particular stillness of a man accustomed to being in rooms where things were decided. "Mr. Dawson," Pruitt said. Not a greeting, just an identification. His eyes moved to Evelyn. "And who's this?" "Evelyn Cross. I'm assisting Mr. Dawson." "This is a property hearing, Miss Cross, not a social occasion." "I understand that. I'm here in an administrative capacity." She kept her voice even and her face neutral, and she sat in one of the chairs in front of the desk without being invited to, which established something minor but worth establishing. Foley set his briefcase on the chair beside her and opened it. "Mr. Dawson's attorney," he said. Pruitt looked at the well-dressed man in the corner, a glance so brief it was nearly nothing, and the man in the corner gave no visible response. The hearing ran 2 hours. Pruitt presented Granger's water access complaint with the mechanical precision of someone reciting something he'd been handed rather than something he understood. The 3 alleged violations were described in language that was specific in the wrong ways, details that sounded technical but didn't correspond to anything in the actual property documents. Foley addressed each one with the territorial survey documents, the original land grant, and finally, the letter from Cheyenne. His voice didn't rise. He stated facts and cited references and let the documents speak without dramatizing them, which was, Evelyn thought, the right approach. Pruitt listened to all of it with the expression of a man who has already decided and is waiting for the talking to finish. Then he thanked them for their presentations and said he'd have a ruling by the following Wednesday. Outside on the boardwalk, in the full morning sun, Cole stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the street. "He'll rule against me," he said. "Probably," Foley agreed. "But there is now a recorded hearing in which the territorial letter was entered into evidence. If he rules against documented territorial law, the appeal to Cheyenne has teeth. And how long does an appeal take?" Foley was quiet for a moment. "Months, possibly longer." Cole looked at the sky. Something moved across his face, the calculation of a man counting months against margins. "It gives us time," Evelyn said, and both men looked at her. "The appeal process being slow is a problem, but it's also a structure. Granger can't force a resolution while an appeal is pending without exposing himself to territory-level scrutiny. He knows that. If he's been doing this for 2 years, he knows exactly how far the process extends his reach and where it cuts it off." "He'll find another way to pressure," Cole said. "Yes," she agreed. "He will." She didn't say she was afraid of what that way might be. She didn't need to say it. They all knew it. The answer to what Granger's next move looked like came not from the sheriff's office or a letter or a formal process of any kind, but from a 10-year-old boy named Caleb Marsh, the son of a family who'd sold their ranch to Granger the previous year and now worked on what had been their own land as hired hands. Caleb appeared at the Dawson Ranch gate on a Sunday afternoon, riding a mule that was too big for him, and he asked for Evelyn specifically, which surprised her enough that she went out to the gate herself rather than sending Cole. "My pa said not to come," the boy said. He looked like he hadn't slept. "My ma said I should anyway." "What's happened?" "Nothing yet. But Mr. Granger had men at our place last night talking to Pa. They didn't know I was in the loft." He looked past her toward the house, then back. "They said they were going to make a complaint to the county welfare board about the little girl here. Say her pa's not fit to raise her proper." Evelyn kept her face still. "Did they say anything else?" "Said a child living with an unmarried woman who isn't family was a scandal and they could get the county to look into it." Caleb shifted on the mule. "I don't think it's true. I think they just want to make trouble. My ma says they like to use the law like a club." "Your mother is right," Evelyn said. "Thank you for coming, Caleb. You did the right thing." She gave him a biscuit from her pocket because she'd been carrying them out to the kitchen garden and hadn't emptied her apron, and he rode away looking slightly less burdened. She stood at the gate for a moment in the afternoon light. Then she went to find Cole. He was in the barn brushing down the bay mare, and he listened to her without interrupting, which was his way. He let you finish before he responded, which was a better quality than most people managed. When she was done, he kept brushing the horse for a moment longer, and she could see him turning it over. "It's not a real complaint," he said. "It doesn't have to be real to cause damage. If a welfare officer comes out here and sees that your housekeeper is a single woman with no formal relationship to this family, they can raise questions that are hard to answer quickly. Questions that, in the meantime, could give Granger grounds to petition for Lily's temporary placement elsewhere while the matter is reviewed." Cole stopped brushing. He looked at the mare's flank without seeing it. "They can't do that," he said. "They can start a process that could do that. I don't know how far it would get, but I know that Granger isn't using this because he thinks he'll win it in a courthouse. He's using it because the process itself is the weapon. You spend 2 months responding to a welfare inquiry. You're not spending those 2 months on the water rights appeal." Cole was very still. "If I had a formal legal relationship to this household," Evelyn said carefully, "it removes the question." He turned and looked at her. She kept her voice and her face as practical as she could make them, because this needed to be said plainly and received plainly, and neither of them could afford to be confused about what it was. "I'm talking about a legal marriage," she said, "not a romantic one. I'm talking about a piece of paper that closes the door on this specific line of attack. It doesn't change what you owe me or what I do here or how either of us lives our life. It just removes the vulnerability." Cole put the brush down on the barn rail. He looked at her for a long time. "That's a significant thing to propose," he said. "I know." "For a practical reason." "For a practical reason," she agreed. "Though I'd also say that what we've built here in 3 weeks is more of a real partnership than a lot of marriages I've seen. I'm not pretending it would be something it isn't. I'm saying what it would protect." He looked at the mare, then at the barn door, then finally back at her. "You'd be giving up." He paused, seeming to realize he wasn't certain what she'd be giving up. "The chance for something else. I came to Wyoming Territory to build a life. This is a life." She said it plainly. "I'm not doing it out of sacrifice. I'm doing it because it makes sense, and because I think we can make it work." Outside, somewhere beyond the barn, Lily was singing to herself again. That same wandering, invented melody she deployed in the afternoons when she was happy and unobserved. It drifted in through the open barn door and sat between them in the dust-moted air. Cole listened to it for a moment. Lily would be... He stopped. "She'd be glad." "I know she would." He looked at Evelyn with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not open, exactly, but less closed. Like something had shifted by a degree or two and was still shifting. "All right," he said. And this time it didn't sound like a decision being arrived at under duress, or a man allowing something he wasn't certain about. It sounded like a man who had looked at the facts of his situation and made the choice that made the most sense, and was, perhaps, also the choice he would have made for reasons that had nothing to do with Granger or welfare complaints or property rights. If he'd been the kind of man who made choices for those other reasons freely. He wasn't that kind of man yet. Maybe not ever. But the door, she thought, was less closed than it had been. They told Henry Foley on Monday morning. He blinked once, recalibrated in whatever way small, precise men recalibrated, and then said he could have the paperwork processed by Wednesday, which would put a legal marriage certificate in existence before Pruitt's ruling came out. This was not accidental timing, and all three of them understood it. They were married on Tuesday in Foley's office, which was small and smelled of old paper and good wood, with Foley as witness and his secretary, a woman named Agnes, as the second one required. Agnes cried a little, quietly, and apologized for it, and Evelyn told her not to apologize, that the occasion warranted some feeling. Cole was wearing his better shirt, which was clean and had all its buttons, and he'd shaved. Evelyn wore the blue dress she'd been keeping for good occasions and had not yet used. It was a gray morning, the sky low and the air carrying the first suggestion of the summer heat that was coming. They signed the papers. When they rode back to the ranch, Lily was in the kitchen garden with Tom Briggs, supervising the staking of the bean plants, which she felt strongly required more stakes than Tom had thus far applied. She looked up when they came through the gate and registered something in their faces or their posture that children register before they understand it, and she abandoned the beans and came running across the yard. "What happened?" she demanded. "Something happened. We got married," Cole said. He said it in the same tone he used for everything, flat, plain, without decoration. Lily looked from him to Evelyn and back. Her face moved through several expressions quickly. "Does that mean Evelyn's staying?" she asked. "Yes," Evelyn said. Lily considered this with the gravity of someone receiving genuinely significant news. Then she nodded once, turned around, and went back to arguing with Tom about the beansteaks. Cole looked at Evelyn. There might have been something like the beginning of a smile on his face, though it didn't fully materialize. "That's Lily," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I like her enormously." That afternoon, Evelyn went into town alone on an errand she hadn't mentioned to Cole. She went to the general store and asked Gus Fielder if she could leave a notice on his board. He said yes, as he said yes to most things, with good-natured incuriosity. She pinned up a carefully written notice that invited any family in the Red Hollow area who had received questionable fines, fees, or legal pressures from Granger's land management office to write their account to a postal box she'd rented at the depot. The same place where, weeks ago, she'd stood penniless and alone and learned that Harold Gentry was dead. She didn't know what would come of it. She didn't know if anyone would write or if they'd be too afraid to, or if what arrived would amount to anything useful. What she knew was that Victor Granger had spent 2 years operating on the assumption that each person he pressured was isolated. That isolation was his strategy. Keep everyone dealing with their private version of the same problem, because people dealing with private versions of problems don't look up to see who else is in the same room. She was going to try to change that. On Wednesday, Pruitt's ruling came. As expected, he found in favor of Granger's water access complaint on 2 of the 3 alleged violations and levied a fine. Foley filed the appeal to Cheyenne by end of day. What Pruitt's ruling did not address, because it could not now address without stepping on the marriage certificate that was now in the county record, was the welfare complaint about Lily. That door was closed. One door closed, others still open. Evelyn put the ruling in the folder with the rest of the documents and went back to the ranch and made supper. And that night, after Lily was in bed and Cole was on the porch, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the account ledger and wrote a third letter. To a newspaper in Cheyenne she'd seen referenced in one of Foley's documents. A territorial paper, the kind that ran stories about property law and public interest. She didn't send it yet. She held it. But she had it. Outside, the first of the summer lightning was moving along the northern ridge, too far away for thunder, just light arriving and departing in the dark. Cole's boots sounded on the porch as he shifted his weight, the old wood settling under him. It had been 3 weeks since she'd arrived with $12 in her pocket and someone else's name in her ear. The ranch was not safe. The man on the porch was not easy. The fight ahead was not small. She had never been more certain in her careful and deliberate way that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of her traveling bag, where she'd kept the return ticket to Cleveland that she still hadn't used and didn't intend to. The lightning moved again, silent, across the dark northern sky. The letter started arriving 2 weeks after she'd pinned the notice at Gus Fielder's store. Not a flood, nothing so dramatic as that. A trickle, careful and anonymous, the way communication moved when people were afraid of being seen communicating. Some were written on good paper in educated hands. Others were penciled on whatever had been available. The words pressed hard as though the writer needed the physical effort to commit to what they were saying. All of them told versions of the same story, with variations in the details that made each one specific and real in the way only true things were specific and real. A widow named Clara Hess described receiving a boundary adjustment notice that had moved her property line 40 feet east, shrinking her grazing access without any surveyor's verification. She'd paid a lawyer to contest it, spent 3 months in correspondence with Pruitt's office, and received a final determination that used language she didn't recognize from any legitimate legal document she'd ever seen. She'd sold 6 months later at 60 cents on the dollar. A family named Ostrander had received a tax reassessment on their well, a private well they dug themselves on their own land, reclassifying it as a commercial water source and therefore subject to a use fee. The fee itself was modest. The principle of it, and the implication that disputing it would lead to a full property audit, was not. A man named Frank Drew, who ran a small cattle operation 2 miles north of the Dawson property, had found 3 of his fence posts uprooted and thrown in a ditch the same week he'd refused Granger's initial offer. He hadn't been able to prove anything. He'd fixed the posts himself and not said a word to anyone, because he had a wife and 2 boys, and he'd made the calculation that silence was cheaper than the alternative. Frank Drew wrote his account in one long paragraph without punctuation, as though stopping to breathe might let him change his mind about sending it. Evelyn read every letter twice. She organized them by date, by type of pressure applied, by the amounts of money involved. She wrote back to every person who had included a return address, which was not everyone, thanking them and asking if they were willing to have their account shared, not publicly, not yet, but with the attorney in Sutton Falls whom she'd now managed to contact directly by letter and who had written back with enough interest to be worth pursuing. The attorney's name was James Carver. He was 43, had practiced property and land rights law in Wyoming Territory for 12 years, and had a particular professional interest in what he described in his letter as the systematic misapplication of regulatory language to create extrajudicial financial pressure on landowners. He used that phrase with the specificity of someone who'd seen it before and had been looking for the right circumstance to address it properly. She wrote to him again with the organized summary of what she'd collected. She was careful. She didn't overstate anything. She let the pattern speak, because the pattern was the argument. Not any single instance, but the fact that a dozen different people on the same stretch of Eastern Territory had experienced the same categories of pressure in the same sequence over the same 2-year period. She didn't tell Coles about the letters right away. Not because she was keeping anything from him, she wasn't, but because she wanted to know what she had before she put it in front of him. He was a man who responded to things he could act on. Showing him half a strategy was worse than showing him none, because it would produce a frustrated impatience she understood but couldn't use yet. She told him on the evening she received Carver's second letter, which said that what she'd sent him was, in his professional assessment, sufficient to support a formal petition to the Territorial Land Authority alleging a coordinated campaign of fraudulent regulatory action. She put the letter on the porch rail in front of him and waited while he read it. He read it 3 times. She could tell by the pace of his eyes. "This Carver," he said. "You trust him?" "I trust that he sees something worth his professional effort in what we have. A lawyer in Sutton Falls doesn't take on Victor Granger's operation for charity. He thinks he can win something." "What does he need from us?" "The original documents, certified copies, and statements from anyone willing to put their name to one." She took the letter back. "The people who wrote to me, most of them are afraid, but some of them are angry enough that the fear has moved to second place." Cole looked at the dark. The summer had settled in properly now, the evening still warm at 9 o'clock, the sky holding its last light long past supper. The ranch was running better than it had been. She could see it in the numbers, in the way the morning had more room in it, in the fact that Lily was learning to read with genuine momentum and had the week before sounded out a 3-syllable word from her primer, and looked up with an expression of such startled pleasure that both Evelyn and Cole had laughed at the same moment, which was a thing they did more often than either of them had noticed. "Frank Drew," Cole said. She blinked. "You know him?" His father and my father ran cattle on adjacent pastures for 12 years. Frank's a stubborn man, but he's honest and he doesn't forget things. Cole's jaw moved. He never said a word about the fence posts. He thought saying something would cost him more than fixing it himself. He was probably right. Cole set his cup down. I'll write out to him tomorrow. He might be more willing to talk to you than to a letter from a stranger. He'll talk to me. We go back far enough. Something settled in Cole's expression, a decision being made and filed away. Who else do you think would sign a statement? Clara Hess, maybe. Her situation is documented. There's a surveyor's report that contradicts the boundary adjustment notice. That's exactly what Carver needs. Specifics that can be verified independently. She paused. The Ostrander family I'm less certain about. They have children, and they're still on land they don't own anymore. The risk to them is different. And you want me to be the one to ask. I think they'll hear it differently from you than from me. She kept her voice level. I'm still a stranger to most of these people. You're not. He looked at her. I'll go to Frank tomorrow. You write to Hess and anyone else you think is ready. And he stopped. Something shifted. I think we should have people here. At the ranch. Not a meeting exactly, but dinner, maybe. Let people see each other. Know they're not alone in this. She had thought the same thing and had not said it yet, waiting to see if he'd get there himself. That he had told her something about where his head was. He was not thinking anymore about surviving this. He was thinking about changing it. Saturday, she said. Saturday. They sat in the quiet for a while. The first crickets had started in the grass near the fence line, and above the barn, the stars were coming out in the order they always came out. The bright ones first, and then the lesser ones filling in behind. Cole picked up his coffee cup and found it empty, and set it down again without getting up to refill it. It's a lot, he said. Not a complaint. An acknowledgement. It is. You didn't sign up for a lot. I signed up for exactly this, she said. I just didn't know what shape it would take. He looked at her sidelong. Are you glad you didn't go back to Cleveland? It wasn't quite a question. She answered it like one anyway. I haven't thought about Cleveland in 3 weeks, she said. That's probably your answer. Something crossed his face that she'd been seeing with increasing frequency lately. Not quite a smile, never quite a smile, but something in that direction. A softening of the lines around his mouth, a particular quality of attention when he looked at her that was different from the careful wariness of the first days. She had not built her expectations on it. She was not the kind of woman who built expectations on things that hadn't been named. But she noticed it, in the honest and private part of herself that noticed things without dramatizing them, and she thought it meant something real even if neither of them was ready to say what. Saturday came. She cooked for 2 days beforehand. Not elaborate food, just enough of it, the kind of cooking that fed working people and didn't require gratitude. Cole and Tom Briggs set up the yard with benches and the long table from the barn, and Lily, who had been informed there would be company and had received this news with the focused enthusiasm she brought to most opportunities for human interaction, had spent Thursday afternoon collecting wildflowers and arranging them in jars along the table. 8 families came. More than Evelyn had expected, fewer than she'd hoped. They came in wagons and on horseback, some with children, some without, and they ate and talked with the particular careful quality of people who had not recently been in a room with other people they trusted. Frank Drew was there, a big, quiet man with a handshake that meant something. And he'd brought his wife, who had the eyes of someone who'd spent 2 years watching her husband carry something heavy and alone. Clara Hess came by herself on a horse that was too old for the distance and refused to say so. The Ostrander family did not come. Cole worked the yard the way Evelyn had never seen him work, moving from group to group, not gregarious. He didn't have it in him to be gregarious, but present and direct and willing to say the specific thing that needed saying instead of the general comfortable thing. He told Frank Drew plainly that he knew about the fence posts and that he was sorry it had taken this long for anyone to say so. She could see Frank's wife look at Cole and then look away and press her lips together in the way of a woman who was relieved in a direction she couldn't entirely explain. Evelyn moved through the gathering with coffee and plates and let people talk without inserting herself too much. She was listening. She was always listening in a gathering like this because people said different things when they thought they were just talking than when they thought they were making a formal account of something. She heard 3 more stories she hadn't had before. She stored them away. After supper, when the light had dropped and someone had lit the yard lanterns, Cole stood at the head of the table and told them what they had. He didn't editorialize. He laid out the documents, the Cheyenne letter, what Carver had said, and what it meant. He told them what signing a statement would involve, and what it might cost, and what it might, if enough of them did it, accomplish. The yard was quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of people turning serious things over. Frank Drew spoke first. "I'll sign," he said. "I should have said something 2 years ago." Clara Hess said, "Send me the paper. I've got the surveyor's report still. I kept everything." 3 other families agreed before the evening was out. One man, whose name Evelyn didn't know, said he couldn't risk it. He was behind on a bank payment, and the bank was Granger's bank, and he couldn't afford to be noticed. Nobody argued with him. The risk was real, and nobody in that yard was going to tell another person that their fear was wrong. 8 families came. 5 were willing to stand up. It wasn't a movement. It was a beginning. The night after the gathering, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table writing up her notes while Cole washed the dishes, which he'd started doing without comment about 2 weeks prior, and which she had not remarked on. The house was quiet. Lily was deeply asleep. She'd stayed up past her bedtime talking to Frank Drew's youngest about horses, and had crashed completely by 8:30. Cole dried the last bowl and hung the cloth. "Carver needs to know about Drew and Hess," he said. "I'll write to him tomorrow." "And the others?" "Yes." She looked up. "Cole, this is going to get worse before Granger decides it's too expensive to keep pushing." "I know. When it gets worse," she chose her words carefully, "I want you to tell me. Don't try to manage it privately and tell me after. We can't afford to be in different rooms on this." He leaned against the counter and looked at her with that careful, honest attention she'd come to rely on. "Same goes," he said. She nodded. They understood each other. She did not know, in that moment, how soon she would need to mean it. It was a Thursday, 12 days after the gathering, when they went to town together. A practical trip. Supplies. A meeting with Foley to deliver certified document copies. A stop at the post office where Evelyn had a letter from Carver that Foley had mentioned was waiting. They'd left Lily with Tom Briggs, as they'd done before, with instructions about the afternoon feeding and a reminder to Lily that she was to practice the letters from her primere and not spend the entire afternoon convincing Tom to look at bugs with her. Lily had agreed to this with the expression of someone agreeing to terms they planned to renegotiate at first opportunity. They were in town 3 hours. It should have been 2, but Foley had questions about the Hess surveyor's report, and Evelyn had answers that led to more questions. And Carver's letter was longer than expected and contained 2 specific requests for additional documentation that needed to be discussed and planned for. It was a good 3 hours. Productive. The kind of afternoon that felt like real progress being made in the particular unromantic way that real progress usually moved. Through paperwork, through specifics, through one careful step followed by another. They were a mile out of town on the east road when Cole said, "Smoke." She looked where he was looking, east, the direction of the ranch. It was not the controlled thin smoke of a cook fire or a burn pile. It was the wrong color and the wrong shape, rising in a column that had the billowing quality of something with volume behind it. Cole put his heels to his horse, and she followed, and they covered the mile at a pace that left no room for the kind of thought that might have made the approach to what they were seeing easier to absorb. The barn was on fire, not the house. The house was intact, and she caught that fact first and held it like a handhold while she took in the rest. Tom Briggs was at the pump working the handle, and Lily was standing at the kitchen garden fence where Tom had clearly put her and told her to stay, and she was staying. White-faced, rigid, watching the barn with the particular stillness of a child who has been told not to move and is obeying because the adults are frightened. Cole was off his horse before it stopped moving, running toward the barn, and Evelyn was a half-second behind him, but she grabbed his arm. "Cole, Nora's in there." He pulled against her grip. "The bay. She's in there." The bay mare, the last horse his wife had chosen. The one he'd told her about in those first weeks with that particular careful flatness that meant it mattered. She felt the grip of it, and she let go, because she understood that some things were not negotiable, and she'd known from the beginning that this was one of them. "Go left," she said. The fire's heaviest on the right side. Go left and low. He went. She ran to Lily. The girl turned when Evelyn's hands came down on her shoulders and looked up at her with eyes that were wide but not crying yet. She was still on the side of the terror where shock held the tears back. He went in, Lily said. I know. Is he going to? He knows what he's doing. Evelyn crouched to Lily's level. Her heart was doing something unpleasant against her ribs, but her voice came out level, which was the thing that mattered. Tom needs your help. Can you run to the creek and fill the other bucket? The red one. Can you do that? Giving a child a task was not a trick. It was a mercy. Lily grabbed the red bucket from the fence post and ran. Evelyn stood up and looked at the barn. The structure had a stone foundation and good timber walls, and the fire was concentrated in the east side, the hayloft. Whoever had set it, and it had been set, she was certain of that with the same cold certainty she'd been building for weeks, had chosen the hayloft because it was the most combustible and the farthest from the house, and the place where a fire, if not caught early enough, would ensure the whole structure went. The east wall was burning through. The roof over it was not going to hold much longer. Tom Briggs was managing the pump with the focused panic of a man doing the only thing available to him and knowing it wasn't enough. She went to him and took the bucket from the second hook and started filling it without ceremony. How long? She said. Saw it maybe 20 minutes after you left. Smell first, then smoke. I got Lily outside first. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. I didn't see anyone. I was with Lily in the garden, and then I smelled it. 20 minutes of start time. She looked at the barn again, calculated. Then Cole came out. He came through the side door in the west wall, the one that opened onto the small paddock, and he was leading the bay mare with a rope, and the mare was moving badly. Not injured, but terrified, her eyes rolling and her hooves skittering on the ground because horses did not understand fire, and everything in their body told them to go, and he was making her come the wrong direction, away from the flame, but still too close. His jacket was gone. His left forearm had a burn on it. She could see it from 20 feet away, the skin angry and red where he'd gotten too close to something. He got the mare to the far paddock fence and tied her, and she screamed once and then stood shaking, and then Cole turned back toward the barn. No, Evelyn said. She had covered the distance between them without deciding to. No, Cole. There's nothing else in there. The tack is replaceable. She put herself between him and the barn door. You are not going back in there. He looked at her. His face was smudged with smoke and his eyes were bright with the kind of adrenaline that made men do things they wouldn't do otherwise. She had never stood in front of a man this close to the edge of something and held her ground, and she was not certain she could, except that she was doing it. The tack can be replaced, she said again, slower. Look at your arm. He looked down. The burn had to be hurting. She could see it, but he'd been running on something that had overridden the signal. He looked at his arm with the slightly surprised expression of a man who had noticed pain arriving late. Come away from it, she said. Come away. He came. The east wall of the barn caved in about 20 minutes later, taking the hayloft with it and sending a cascade of sparks up into the still afternoon air. Tom and Evelyn kept working the pump and throwing water on the remaining walls and the roof edge and the ground around the structure, and slowly, and not without cost, they kept it from spreading to the house or the feed shed or the paddock where the bay mare was still shaking against the fence. By the time it was out, the east side of the barn was rubble. The west side was damaged but standing. The horses, there were 3 in the paddock now. Tom had gotten the others out while Cole was in the barn, were alive. The house was intact. Cole sat on the ground with his back against the paddock fence and his burned arm across his knee, and he looked at the ruin of the east wall for a long time without speaking. Lily came and sat beside him. She didn't say anything either. She just sat against his shoulder, and he put his good arm around her and they looked at it together. Evelyn stood a few feet away with Tom Briggs and they talked quietly about what had started it. Tom had found the source on his own assessment. An area of accelerant near the base of the hayloft ladder, the smell of coal oil still detectable under the smoke if you were close enough. He'd said nothing to Cole about it yet. She hadn't either. When Cole finally spoke, it was to Lily. You all right? Yes. Lily paused. Nora's all right? I know. Is the barn going to be okay? Part of it, Cole said. We can fix the other part? Yes, we can fix it. Lily seemed to accept this as sufficient in the pragmatic way she accepted most things. She leaned harder against her father's shoulder. Evelyn crouched down in front of Cole. She took his burned arm carefully by the wrist and looked at the damage properly for the first time. The burn ran along the inside of his forearm, about 6 inches. It was not the worst burn she'd seen. A child in her classroom in Cleveland had gotten far worse from a kitchen accident. But it was serious enough, and it needed attention. "This needs to be cleaned and wrapped," she said. "I know." "Inside." "In a minute." She let him have his minute. She stood up and looked at what was left of the east wall, the way the afternoon light was moving through the smoke that still rose from the collapsed section. The way the smell of burned wood and coal oil was something she was going to remember for a long time. She looked at the road, the east road that ran back toward Red Hollow, that ran past the Granger property line 6 miles north, that had carried a well-dressed young man with an envelope and a message that had started all of this. She thought about what a man did when he realized pressure and paperwork and legal maneuvering hadn't worked. She thought about what came after patience ran out. She thought, he's made a mistake. Not because burning a barn was a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was a crime, a real one, the kind that left evidence and witnesses and a physical record of itself in the form of coal oil soaked into scorched earth. Granger had been careful for 2 years. This was not careful. This was a man who had gotten accustomed to winning by inches, deciding to swing hard. And people who swung hard left themselves exposed in ways that careful men did not. She looked at Cole, still sitting against the fence with Lily against his shoulder. She looked at the burned arm, the terrified horse, the fallen wall. And then she went to find Tom Briggs because she needed him to ride to town tonight with a message for Foley and a separate one for the family of Frank Drew. And she needed him to stop at 2 other homesteads on the way back and tell those families quietly that something had changed and they needed to know about it. Tom looked at her when she told him. "Tonight?" he said. "Tonight," she said. "Tell them what happened. Don't editorialize. Just tell them what happened and tell them I said the time for being quiet about it is over." Tom looked at the ruined east wall of the barn. He looked at Cole. He looked back at her. "All right, Mrs. Dawson," he said. She had been Mrs. Dawson for 3 weeks by then. It still caught her slightly, the particular quality of hearing herself called that, not unpleasantly, just in the way of something still being grown into. She nodded. Tom saddled his horse and was on the east road before dark. Evelyn went inside and cleaned and wrapped Cole's arm with the careful efficiency she brought to anything that required care. He sat at the kitchen table and let her do it without the resistance she'd half expected. He was tired, the adrenaline gone, what was left underneath it quieter and more considered. "It was Granger," he said. Flat, a statement. "Almost certainly. We can't prove it. Not tonight." She tied off the bandage and sat down across from him. "But Tom Briggs smelled coal oil. Tom will say so. And a fire set deliberately on a property that is currently in an active legal dispute with a specific party is not a thing that officials in Cheyenne will be able to ignore the way they ignored a letter from a woman they'd never heard of." Cole looked at his wrapped arm. "People are going to hear about this," she said. "Tom's writing to tell them now. Not because I want them upset, because they need to know that Granger just did something that can be documented, reported, and entered into an official record in a way that our complaints so far could not be." She leaned forward slightly. "He made himself visible. That's what we've been waiting for." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at her with an expression that was neither soft nor hard, but something in the space between those things, the expression of a man who has run out of the particular stubbornness that kept him from seeing what was in front of him. "I should have done this a year ago," he said. "Found the others. Talked to Carver. I thought I could outlast it." "You were trying to protect what you had by not drawing attention to it," she said. "That's not stupidity. That's a reasonable calculation under the circumstances." "It was the wrong one." "Maybe, but you're making the right one now." He looked at her for a long moment. "You came here with $12 and a letter of reference," he said, "and in 6 weeks you've built something I couldn't build in 2 years. She thought about how to answer that. "You built it," she said finally. "You had the documents. You had the neighbors. You had the land and the history and Frank Drewey's phone number in your head. I just organized the room." He shook his head slightly, disagreeing, but he didn't push it. Lily appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, hair loose, carrying her primer against her chest. "I did my letters," she said. "All of them." "All of them?" Evelyn said. "Even the hard ones. Even Q." Lily came to the table and held out the slate board, on which the entire alphabet had been chalked in the careful, oversized letters of a child who was concentrating very hard. "Can you check them?" Evelyn took the board. She looked at each letter. They were not all correct. The S was backwards, and the lowercase b and d were mirror images of each other, in the way they always were at this stage, the particular confusion of a young brain that had not yet locked in the asymmetry. But they were all there, and they'd been done, and the Q was genuinely creditable. "These are very good," she said. "The S wants to go the other direction. The rest are right." Lily took the board back and studied the S. Cole watched his daughter correct the letter, brow furrowed, the tip of her tongue visible between her teeth in the way that meant she was working. Evelyn watched Cole watch Lily. Outside, the dark had come down, and the ruined east wall of the barn was a shadow against the sky. And somewhere on the east road, Tom Briggs was riding toward lights and windows, where people needed to know what had happened today. In the morning, there would be difficult things to attend to. The sheriff would have to be notified, the damage assessed, letters written, Carver informed. The work ahead was not small, and it was not going to resolve itself tidily or quickly. But in the kitchen, a little girl was fixing a backwards letter on a slate board while her father watched with an expression that was, if not exactly peaceful, then at least present, not braced against the next thing, not calculating the next loss, just there, in that room, for that moment. Evelyn got up and put the kettle on. Some battles were fought in courtrooms, and some were fought in barns, and some were fought in kitchens at the end of long days, in the ordinary and stubborn act of staying. She was staying. Tom Briggs came back from his ride the next morning with mud on his boots and the particular look of a man who had covered distance in the dark and had things to report. He found Evelyn in the kitchen before Cole was up, which was unusual enough that she took it as a signal he'd timed it that way. She poured him coffee and sat across from him and let him talk. Frank Drury had been awake when Tom arrived. Not coincidentally, Frank's wife had said her husband hadn't been sleeping well for months, which was the kind of detail that told you everything about what carrying something in silence did to a person over time. Frank had listened to Tom's account of the fire without interrupting, and then he'd sat for a moment in the way of a man arriving at the end of a long interior argument, and then he'd said, "Enough." His wife had said it first, actually. Tom reported this with the slight careful quality of a man representing the facts accurately. Frank's wife had said enough before Frank did, and Frank had looked at her and nodded. Clara Hess had not been in bed. She'd been at her kitchen table with the surveyor's report spread in front of her and a lamp burning, which Tom said she'd explained by telling him she took the report out sometimes at night because looking at the evidence of what had been done to her kept her from making peace with it when she wasn't ready to make peace with it yet. She'd stood up when she heard about the fire and said she would ride to Red Hollow herself in the morning, and she wanted to know where to find James Carver. Two of the other families Tom had stopped at had said they needed to talk to their spouses before they could commit. One had said no, without elaboration, and Tom had respected that and moved on. It was not everyone. It was enough. Evelyn sent a wire to Carver that morning from the Red Hollow depot. Because Foley had a telegraph connection, she'd arranged access to the week prior, and this was no longer a situation for letters. The wire was concise. Fire at Dawson property confirmed arson by coal oil evidence. 5 families with documented complaints willing to provide sworn statements. Request your earliest availability. Red Hollow. Carver's reply came the following afternoon. Arriving Thursday. Arrange meeting space. Bring everything. She arranged the meeting space. Foley's office, which was small but had the advantage of being a legal office, and therefore lending a certain gravity to proceedings conducted in it. She told Foley what was coming and watched him sit with it for a moment, and then straighten up in his chair with the expression of a man who had been waiting for the weight of something to shift in a direction he could work with. Cole spent those 3 days doing what he did best, which was hard physical work directed at a clear problem. He and Tom assessed the barn damage properly and made a list of what could be salvaged and what needed to be replaced. He rode out to Frank Drew's property on Wednesday morning and came back that afternoon without reporting on the conversation in detail, just saying that Frank was coming Thursday and was bringing his written account. His arm was healing. She changed the dressing every morning, and he submitted to this with a patience she appreciated. And by Wednesday, the angry red had begun to settle into the darker color of a burn that was closing properly. On Wednesday evening, he came in from checking the cattle and found her at the table with all the documents spread and organized in the order she planned to walk Carver through them. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the scope of it. The weeks of letters, the fine records, the Cheyenne correspondence, the notes from the gathering, the coal oil report Tom had written out in his own hand at her request. And something moved across his face that she didn't try to name. He sat down at the table beside her, not across, which was different from their usual arrangement, and he looked through the stack from the beginning. "You kept all of it," he said. "Every piece." He turned pages slowly. She watched him read his own history back. The fines that had bled him, the legal maneuvers that had cost him more than money, the accumulated weight of 2 years of being pressured by a system that was supposed to protect people like him and had instead been turned against him. He stopped at the letter Clara Hess had sent. "Read it. Put it down." "She lost 60 cents on the dollar," he said. "Yes." And she still came forward. "She's angry," Evelyn said. "Anger is a better fuel than fear, over a long distance." Cole looked at the table, then at her. "I was afraid," he said, plainly and without apparent discomfort, the way he said most things he'd decided to say. "For 2 years I was afraid of what fighting back would cost Lily. So I managed it instead of fighting it. I kept things small so the target stayed small." He paused. "I don't know if that was wrong. It was a rational response to a real threat," she said, "and it kept the ranch and it kept Lily. Those aren't nothing. But it didn't stop him." "No," she agreed. "It didn't stop him, but it kept you in a position to stop him when the circumstances changed." She looked at the stack of documents. "Granger's been winning for 2 years because every person he pressured made the same calculation you did. Keep quiet, stay small, survive. That's a reasonable calculation. It's also exactly what he was counting on. The fire was him losing patience because the calculation stopped working. Because wheat stopped making it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous way to read it," he said. "It's an accurate way." She met his eyes. "You didn't fail for 2 years. You endured for 2 years until the conditions were right for something different. Those aren't the same thing." He held her gaze for a moment. She'd noticed that he'd gotten more comfortable doing that in recent weeks, holding a look instead of deflecting it, as though he'd decided that seeing and being seen was a thing he could manage. "I'm glad you didn't take that coach east," he said. It was, for Cole Dawson, a significant statement. She treated it accordingly. "So am I," she said. Lily appeared in the doorway in her nightgown with her primer and the expression of someone who had been waiting for an appropriate moment and had decided this was it. "I can read the first page," she announced. "The whole thing. Without stopping." Cole and Evelyn both looked at her. "Show us," Cole said. Lily came to the table, opened her primer to the first page, and read. She stumbled twice, on enough because the GH was a betrayal, and on animal because the second syllable came out email before she corrected herself. But she read the whole page without stopping, and when she finished, she looked up with the expression of someone who had just done a hard thing and knew it. Cole said, "Again." Lily read it again. This time she only stumbled once. "Good," Cole said. And then, after a moment, more quietly, "Your mother would have liked that." Lily looked at him with the clear, serious eyes of a child receiving something real. "I know," she said, and she closed the primer and went back to bed, which was somehow the exact right response. Evelyn straightened the documents on the table. Cole sat for another moment. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to add to what had just happened, and they'd both learned that some things didn't need adding to. James Carver arrived Thursday on the noon stage from Sutton Falls. He was not what she'd expected, which she noted as a reminder that she did not always have accurate expectations. She'd pictured, from his letters, someone older and more austere. Carver was 43, with the kind of face that had settled into itself comfortably. Not handsome, not imposing, just the face of a man who'd spent 12 years in courtrooms, and had decided somewhere along the way that pretense-used energy he preferred to apply elsewhere. He shook her hand with the same firmness he shook Cole's, which she appreciated without mentioning. He looked at the documents for 2 hours before he said anything substantive. He asked questions while he read, Specific, precise questions that showed he knew exactly what he was looking at. And Evelyn answered them, and Cole answered some, and Foley sat in the corner providing legal context when Carver needed it. When he was done reading, Carver leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The arson is the key," he said. "Not because it's the most egregious thing. The fraudulent fee structure and the illegal boundary adjustment are arguably more systematically harmful. But arson is unambiguous. Arson is not a regulatory gray area. It is a crime, and crimes have a different evidentiary standard and a different institutional response than civil property complaints." He looked at Cole. "You have a witness who can testify to coal oil evidence at the base of the fire." "Tom Briggs," Cole said. "He'll testify." "Does Granger have any connection to your ranch hand? Anyone who could challenge his credibility?" "Tom worked for me before Granger was in this county," Cole said. Carver nodded. He looked at Evelyn. "The organized complaint structure you've built, the letters, the summary, the pattern documentation, this is the piece that turns a single arson case into evidence of a coordinated campaign. One rancher filing an arson complaint against a powerful landowner is something Granger's lawyers can manage. 5 families with documented histories of pressure, combined with a territorial finding that the regulatory framework he's been using has no legal basis, combined with a criminal arson charge." He paused. "That's a different kind of problem." "Oh, can we win?" Cole asked. Carver looked at him with the honest eyes of a man who'd stopped making promises he wasn't certain of sometime in his 30s. "I can build you a case that goes to the territorial court and makes Granger defend himself on multiple fronts simultaneously. He'll have to spend money and exposure and political capital dealing with it. Whether we win in the strict sense depends on variables I don't control." He folded his hands. "But I'll tell you what I've seen in 12 years of this kind of work. Men like Granger calculate risk the way they calculate everything, in terms of cost and return. For 2 years, the cost of pressuring this territory was low, and the return was high. I'm going to make the calculation run the other way." The meeting with the families happened that afternoon in Foley's front room, which was too small for 8 people but managed it. Frank Drew sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set, in the expression of a man who had made up his mind and was done revisiting the decision. Clara Hess sat ramrod straight and put her surveyor's report on Carver's desk before she sat down, as though she'd been waiting to hand it to the right person for a long time. The others arranged themselves as they could. Carver explained what he needed from each of them. Not testimony yet. Sworn statements first, specific and factual, describing only what each person had directly experienced. No editorializing, no speculation about Granger's intent, just the facts with dates. "Will it be enough?" Frank Drew asked. "Combined with the territorial water rights finding and the arson evidence, yes," Carver said. "Individually, each of your stories has gaps Granger's lawyers can work with. Together, the pattern is the argument. You can't dismiss a pattern as coincidence when it involves 12 documented instances across 2 years." "What happens to us while this is going on?" one of the other men asked, a younger rancher named Sutter, whose family had received a fence line notice similar to the Hess boundary adjustment. "Granger still has the bank. He still has Pruitt. He still has those things," Carver agreed. He did not pretend otherwise. "The filing of a formal territorial complaint does not make you immediately safe. It makes you visible in a way that cuts both ways. Granger is less able to move against you quietly because quiet movement becomes evidence of retaliation. But he has resources, and men with resources don't disappear from a situation just because the legal ground shifts." He looked around the room. "I want you to understand what you're agreeing to before you put your names on anything. This is not a quick resolution." The room was quiet for a moment. Frank Drew uncrossed his arms and said, "My fence posts ended up in a ditch. I fixed them myself, and I said nothing for 2 years, and I'm done with that." That seemed to settle something in the room's collective temperature. All 5 families signed. The formal complaint was filed with the Territorial Land Authority in Cheyenne 2 weeks later, with Carver's name on the front page and the documentation Evelyn had compiled attached in full. Foley filed the arson report with the county authorities simultaneously, with Tom Briggs's written account attached. A letter went to the territorial newspaper in Cheyenne, the one Evelyn had drafted weeks ago and held, waiting for the right moment, and Carver reviewed and approved it before it went, trimming the language in 2 places where it was more emotional than evidentiary. The newspaper ran the story 10 days after the complaint was filed, It ran on the front page below the fold, which was not the top of the paper but was not nothing. The headline used the word systematic, which was Carver's word from his letter, and which was, Evelyn thought, exactly the right word. It named Victor Granger specifically, which was the kind of thing newspapers could do when the documentation supported it, and which was what made the story different from rumor. She read it at the kitchen table on a Friday morning while Cole was out checking the summer cattle and Lily was in the kitchen garden with specific instructions to pull only the weeds and leave the carrots alone. She read it twice, the way she read everything twice, and then she set it down and sat with it for a moment. It was not a victory. She was careful not to call it that internally, because calling things victories before they were done was how you got surprised by what came next. But it was something real and visible and on the record, which was what she'd been working towards since she'd sat at this same table weeks ago and written the first letter to a postal box at the Red Hollow Depot. Cole came in at noon and she handed him the paper without comment. He read it standing at the counter, which was his habit with things he read. He never sat down first, just read where he was. When he finished, he put it down and looked at the wall above the stove, at the blue-glazed cup that still sat in its place, undisturbed. "It's real," he said. "It's real," she agreed. He looked at her. There was something in his face that was not gratitude. Gratitude was too thin a word for it, but something more like recognition, the particular look of a person seeing clearly what they're standing in front of. He crossed the kitchen and he put his hand along the side of her face, which he had never done. And she went very still because some moments required stillness, and this was one. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said quietly, "You changed everything." She shook her head slightly. "We changed it. Before you—" He stopped. Started again. "Before you crossed that street to fix Lily's knee, I was managing. Just managing. I'd gotten good at it. I'd decided managing was all there was going to be." His thumb moved once against her cheekbone. "I'd forgotten that there was a difference between surviving a thing and actually living your life." She looked at him. This was the most he'd said, in one continuous stream, about anything internal, in all the weeks she'd known him. She understood what it cost him to say it, not because he was a man who hid from the truth, but because he was a man who'd learned that the truth had a way of asking things of you once you said it out loud. "I hadn't decided that yet," she said, "but I was close." He lowered his hand, but he didn't step back. "This is a real marriage," he said. "Not a question." "It has been for a while," she said. "I think we both know that." He nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd made a decision he wasn't going to revisit. Lily came through the back door with mud on both knees and a carrot in each hand, which she had specifically been told not to pull. She looked at both of them and looked at the carrots. "They needed to come out," she said. Cole looked at his daughter. "We talked about this." "They were ready." Lily held up the carrots. They were, in fact, quite large. "See?" Evelyn took one of the carrots and examined it. "She's not wrong," she said. "They were ready." Cole looked at the carrot, then at his daughter, then at Evelyn, with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered on multiple fronts simultaneously and has decided to accept the outcome. "Wash up," he said to Lily. "Both of you. We're having those for dinner." What followed was not a swift resolution, because things worth resolving rarely resolve swiftly. It was a process, and the process had difficult days in it. Granger's lawyers filed a countermotion with the territorial court in September, challenging the validity of the complaint's documentation on technical grounds. The challenge was dismissed, but it added 6 weeks to the timeline and cost Carver fees that he absorbed without billing Evelyn and Cole for, which she noted and intended to address when she could. Dale Pruitt resigned as sheriff of Red Hollow in October, which surprised no one in town and was announced in a 2-line notice that gave no reason. His replacement was appointed by the county, a man named Garrett Webb, who arrived from outside the territory with no existing relationships in Red Hollow, and therefore no debts to anyone in it. Evelyn met him in his first week and gave him the complete file of Pruitt's documented misconduct, which Foley had assembled, and he read it with a face she couldn't read, and told her he appreciated the thoroughness. The Territorial Land Authority issued its findings in November. The finding was 31 pages, and she read every one of them. It confirmed that the regulatory framework Granger had been applying to Eastern Territory landowners was based on an unadopted draft proposal and had therefore never had legal force. It ordered the reimbursement of all fees collected under that framework to affected landowners, with interest. It referred the broader pattern of documented misconduct to the territorial attorney's office for further review, which was the cautious institutional language for someone is going to face formal charges over this. The reimbursement was not enormous. For some families, it was several $100s. For Clara Hess, whose situation had been the most documentable, it was enough to matter substantially. For Cole, the amount recovered from the illegitimate fines covered most of what he needed to fully repair the barn. Not just the east wall, which needed replacing, but several other repairs he'd been deferring because the margin hadn't been there. The barn went up in 3 days in early December, with help. That was the part she hadn't expected, not in the specific way it happened. She'd thought, when she'd begun organizing people, in terms of legal process and documentation and formal complaint mechanisms. She hadn't thought in terms of people arriving on a Tuesday morning with lumber and tools and food for the noon meal. Frank Drew came with 2 sons she hadn't met before, who were quiet and capable and worked without being directed. Clara Hess arrived with her neighbor, a woman named Ruth Peake, who had never attended any of the gatherings but showed up with a buckboard load of supplies in a matter-of-fact manner that suggested she saw no need to explain herself. The Sutter family sent their eldest boy, who was 17 and could frame a wall. 2 other families Evelyn barely knew sent men with tools. Gus Fielder from the general store came in the afternoon with nails and a statement that he'd been meaning to replace his nail inventory anyway, and the old stock might as well be useful. Cole worked alongside all of them and said little, which was his way, but she watched him move through the day and she saw something she hadn't seen in him before: ease. Not happiness in any grand sense, just the ease of a man who had put down something heavy and whose body was remembering what it felt like to move without it. By Wednesday evening, the east wall was framed. By Thursday, the roof was on. By Friday, it was done. Not finished in every detail, but structurally complete, functional, real. They stood in the yard after the last wagon had left, the 3 of them, in the early winter dark that came fast now, in December. The barn was behind them, the house lit and warm ahead. Lily was holding Cole's hand on one side and Evelyn's on the other, which she'd done without remark, the way children did things that were simply obvious to them. "It's better than before," Lily said, looking at the barn. "It is," Cole agreed, "because more people built it." Neither of the adults answered that. It was true, and it didn't need agreement. Lily let go of both hands and went inside because she was cold, and Cole and Evelyn stood together in the yard for a moment in the way they'd come to stand together at the end of days. Close, not touching, both looking at the same thing. "Carver thinks the Attorney General's office will move on Granger in the new year," Cole said. "He told me the same. The Cheyenne Bank is already distancing itself from his land management operation. They called in 2 of his major notes." "I know." He looked at the side of her face. "You knew before I did. Foley told me yesterday. I was going to tell you tonight. You didn't lead with it. You were working," she paused, "and I wanted to see the barn finished before we talked about what came next." He was quiet for a moment. The cold was proper now, the kind that came in off the high country and meant what it said about the season changing. "What does come next?" he said. She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about most things, without the protective layer of optimism, just looking at what was actually in front of her. What was in front of her was a ranch that was viable now, not just surviving, a legal process that was moving in the right direction slowly, as legal processes moved, a community that had found out it could function as one when the pressure was high enough, a husband who was not easy and not finished grieving and not going to transform into a different kind of man than he was, and whom she respected and trusted more than anyone she'd known in her adult life. A little girl who could read the first page of her primer without stopping, and who had opinions about beansteaks and carrot maturity and the many inadequacies of the letter Q. None of it was what she'd come to Wyoming Territory expecting. None of it was what Harold Gentry's advertisement had described. It was considerably more than that, and it had cost considerably more. And it was entirely hers in the specific way that things were yours when you'd built them from something close to nothing. "I want a kitchen garden that actually produces through the summer," she said. "Not just the second half of it. I want to start the seeds in March instead of May." Cole looked at her. "That's what comes next." "And I want Lily reading full chapters by spring. She's close. She needs the winter to consolidate what she has, and I think by April..." "Evelyn." She stopped. He turned toward her. He was not a demonstrative man, and she had never expected him to be. And so what he did next, which was to take both her hands in his and hold them in the particular careful way of a man handling something he was afraid of dropping, was not something she'd been prepared for. "I meant what comes next for us," he said. She looked at him in the dark, at the lines in his face and the careful eyes and the scar on his jaw she'd never asked about and the burned arm that was healing under his sleeve. At the man who had let her stay and then let her see the accounts and then let her see the grief in his kitchen and then stood beside her in Foley's office, signing a paper that said they were something to each other without knowing exactly what, and had figured it out in the months after by simply living it. "I know what you meant," she said. "And?" She thought about Cleveland, about the return ticket she'd kept in her boot until she'd finally taken it out 3 weeks after the fire and burned it in the kitchen stove. Not dramatically, just disposing of something that was no longer applicable. About the woman she'd been when she'd stepped off the stagecoach, careful, practical, holding herself carefully together over a loss she hadn't let herself fully feel in public. She thought about what it meant to build a life not out of what you'd planned, but out of what you found when you arrived and what you did with it. "I think we're already in the middle of what comes next," she said. "I think we've been in it for a while, and neither of us said so." He looked at her for a long moment. "I love you," he said, plain and direct, in the same tone he used for everything, without decoration. It was perhaps the least romantic delivery of those words she'd ever heard. It was also the most honest, which, with this man, was the same as the most tender. "I know," she said. "I love you too." He nodded. Like a fact confirmed, a column balanced. And then, because he was Cole Dawson, and this was the man she'd chosen, and who had chosen her, he said, "The north fence still needs 3 new posts before the snow gets deep." She laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, unexpected, coming up from somewhere genuine. "I know," she said. "I put it on the list." He squeezed her hands once and then let go, and they went inside together, into the warm and the light and the sound of Lily reading to herself from her primer at the kitchen table, her small voice working through the words with patient concentration, sounding each one out, not stopping when she stumbled, starting again from the beginning of the sentence the way Evelyn had taught her. The kitchen was warm, the barn was standing. The papers were filed and the process was moving, and the East Territory was not yet free, but it was no longer silent, and silence had been Granger's greatest weapon, and it was the one that was gone for good. Evelyn put the kettle on. Cole sat at the table and listened to Lily read and said nothing, which was his version of everything. There is a particular kind of person who arrives somewhere with nothing and builds something real from that nothing, not because they are exceptional in any mythological sense, not because fate chose them or circumstances were kind, but because they looked at what was in front of them and decided, without drama, to do the work. Evelyn Cross had been that person before she came to Red Hollow, and she was that person after. She had not changed who she was. She had found a place where who she was mattered, which is a different thing, and rarer, and worth more than people who have always had a place tend to understand. The ranch did not become prosperous overnight. The legal proceedings against Granger stretched into the following year, and there were setbacks in the spring when his lawyers found a procedural gap in one of the complaint filings that required Carver to refile, which cost 2 months. The Territorial Attorney General's office moved slowly, as such offices always moved, and Victor Granger's formal indictment did not come until 14 months after the fire, by which time he had already quietly divested himself of several properties and retreated to Cheyenne, where men with money retreated when the landscape turned against them. He was not destroyed. Men like that rarely were, completely, but he was diminished, and diminishment in this case was enough. Enough for the Eastern Range to breathe, enough for the families who'd been pressured to recover some of what they'd lost, enough for Frank Drew to sleep through the night without waking at 3 a.m, calculating what the next threat might be. Gus Fielder told Evelyn, the following spring, that people in town had started calling the stretch of road past the Dawson property the stretch where things turned around, which was not a formal name but was the kind of name that stuck in small communities. She wasn't sure the turn had happened there exactly. She thought it had happened in Foley's front room, among 8 people who decided that the cost of speaking was finally less than the cost of staying quiet. She thought it had happened in a dozen kitchen tables across the Eastern Territory, where people had read a letter from a stranger and written back. She thought it had happened in a barn that burned and was rebuilt in 3 days by people who came without being asked, because that was what communities did when they remembered they were communities. She thought, if she was being entirely honest, that it had started on a boardwalk outside a general store when a little girl fell down and a woman crossed the street without deciding to, because the child was hurt and someone needed to help. That was the truth of it, underneath all the documents and legal filings and organized complaints. One moment, one small decision, and everything that grew from it. Lily learned to read that winter. Not just the first page, all of it, the whole primer. And by spring she'd moved to a second book that Evelyn had ordered from a bookseller in Cheyenne. A collection of stories that Lily consumed with the focused hunger of someone who had discovered a new country and intended to explore all of it. Cole built the fence posts before the snow came. All 3 of them in one long Saturday that Evelyn spent partially helping and partially watching and partially thinking about March seed orders. And when they were done, he stood back and looked at the fence line with the satisfaction of a man who had fixed a specific thing that needed fixing, which was, she had come to understand, how Cole Dawson experienced most of his contentment, in the particular, in the repaired, in the thing that had needed doing and was now done. That evening, she found the return ticket to Cleveland, because she'd kept the charred corner of it, the piece that had survived the stove, in the back of the ledger where she filed things she needed to remember. She didn't know exactly why she'd kept it. Perhaps because it was the last evidence of who she'd been the day she arrived. Careful, braced, holding herself against loss with both hands, the return ticket in her boot like a promise she was making to herself that she wouldn't need it. She hadn't needed it. She put it back in the ledger because some things you kept not because they were useful, but because they were true, and truth had a way of being worth preserving. The Wyoming winter came down hard and white, and the ranch went quiet under it the way ranches did. And in the kitchen, the lamp burned late most evenings, and there was almost always coffee on, and Lily read her stories aloud to anyone who would listen. And Cole Dawson sat at the table across from his wife, and looked at her sometimes with that expression that was not quite a smile, but was in every way that mattered something better than one. It was not a perfect life. It was not a resolved life, in the sense that lives were not resolved. There were years of legal process still ahead, and difficult seasons coming that they couldn't predict, and the grief Cole carried for what he'd lost was not a thing that disappeared because circumstances improved, and Evelyn had her own losses she'd learned to carry rather than set down entirely. But it was a real life, built from real things, from letters written and sent and answered, from documents kept in locked boxes and in traveling bags, from a bandage applied to a child's scraped knee, from fence posts replaced, and seeds planted in March instead of May, from the particular and daily and unglamorous work of being present in the place where you'd landed and deciding that it was after everything where you were supposed to be. Outside, the snow came down quiet on the eastern range, covering everything equally. The burned scar where the barn's east wall had been, the repaired fence line, the kitchen garden dormant under its winter cover, the road that ran east toward what had been Granger's land and was now, slowly, returning to the people it had been taken from. Evelyn blew out the kitchen lamp and went to bed. The ranch was quiet. It was home.